I need you to stay with me. I know that sounds like a strange way to begin, but I've thought about how to tell this story for a long time. I've started it in my head 100 different times from 100 different angles, and I keep coming back to the same problem. The problem is this: the moment I tell you what kind of story this is, you'll think you know how it ends. And you don't. Nobody who was in that room knew how it was going to end. Not my mother. Not my brother. Not the attorney who had known my family for 22 years. And if I'm being honest with you, which I intend to be in my way, I'm not entirely sure I knew either. So stay with me, all the way through. Don't decide what this is until it's over. And even then, even after the last word, I want you to sit with it for a moment before you make up your mind. Because this story is not what you think it is. It is also exactly what you think it is. Before I go any further, I want to ask, where are you watching this right now? What time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I want to know who's with me on this one, because this is the story I've never told the full truth of before. Not to anyone. And something about the distance of talking to people I can't see makes it easier to say what actually happened. My name is Adiz Nwosu. I am 41 years old. I am the youngest child of Chukwuemeka and Ngozi Nwosu, who came to this country from Anambra State in Nigeria in 1978 with almost nothing and built, over the following 4 decades, more than most people who started with everything. And on the 14th of November, I sat in a lawyer's office while my family found out exactly how much I had. That is not the complicated part of this story. The complicated part is what I did to get there. Let me tell you about my father first. Chukwuemeka Nwosu was not a man who announced himself. That is the first thing you need to understand. He walked into rooms quietly. He spoke at a volume that required you to lean in slightly, which meant he always had your full attention without ever asking for it. He dressed precisely, pressed trousers, polished shoes, the same style of watch he wore for 30 years, replaced when it stopped working and not before. He did not believe in waste of any kind. Not of money, not of words, not of time, not of the specific energy it takes to make people understand you are someone worth taking seriously. He had found other ways to make that clear. He had come with $40 and a set of skills that weren't easily categorized, a talent for numbers, a patience that bordered on geological, and an instinct for real estate that I do not believe he could have explained if you asked him to. He started with 1 duplex in a neighborhood that everyone else was leaving. He managed it himself, collected the rent personally, repaired what he could, hired contractors for what he couldn't, watched the numbers the way other men watch sports. Within 5 years, he owned 3 properties. Within 15, he owned 8. By the time I was old enough to understand what my father actually had, the portfolio had grown to 12 properties worth somewhere north of $4 million on a modest day. He built it the way rivers build canyons, not by force, by persistence, by the same quiet, patient pressure applied in the same direction for decades. I watched him do it, not because he invited me to watch, just because I was the child who sat in corners at family gatherings while the adults talked, the one who stayed at the table after the meal when my siblings had gone to watch television, the one who noticed things and filed them away and didn't always know what to do with what she'd noticed until years later. My father knew I watched. I believe he appreciated it in his way. He was not a man who expressed appreciation in the conventional forms. He didn't ruffle your hair or tell you he was proud or put your drawings on the refrigerator. His appreciation came in other forms. He would sometimes, mid-conversation with a contractor or a banker, pause and look at me and say, "What do you think?" And everyone at the table would turn to look at this child in the corner, this girl who was supposed to be doing homework, And I would say what I actually thought, which was often not what anyone expected, and my father would nod once and turn back to the conversation. That was love, in the language of Chakumika and Mosu. I received it in full. And then I grew up and left, and the language changed. My brother Emeka was born first and was shaped by that fact in every way a person can be shaped by something that happened before they had any say in it. He was the heir before anyone used the word. From the time he could follow my father from room to room, he followed him from room to room. Property walkthroughs, contractor meetings, bank appointments that should have been adult conversations, but somehow always included Emeka, sitting against the wall in a chair that was too big for him, listening. By 12, he understood cap rates and occupancy ratios. By 16, he was helping my father review lease agreements. By 22, he had his real estate license and was managing 4 of my father's properties under my father's supervision. He was not a complicated man, my brother. He was intelligent and capable, and he loved my parents in the uncomplicated, performative way that oldest sons in families like ours are trained to love. Loudly, publicly, in ways the family could point to. He called every Sunday. He drove my parents to appointments. He sat at the right hand of the table at every gathering. He had internalized his role so completely that it had become invisible to him. He didn't see it as a role. He saw it as himself. This is relevant. Remember it. My sister Chidinma arrived 3 years after Emeka and occupied a completely different position in the family's emotional architecture. She was the beautiful one. Not that beauty was distributed unfairly in our family, but Chidinma wore hers consciously, understood it as a form of currency, and spent it with the precision of a woman who had studied its exchange rate carefully. She was warm. She was funny. She was the kind of person who made every room feel more comfortable simply by entering it, which is a genuine talent and one I do not have and have never pretended to have. She married well, by the family's accounting. Dr. Adeyemi Bakare, a cardiologist, Lagos-born, very good family. The wedding cost what a small house costs in certain parts of Atlanta, and my parents funded every cent of it without flinching, because the wedding was also a statement, and my father understood statements even when he didn't make them himself. Chidinma moved into a house in a suburb whose name I will not give you, because this is not that kind of story. My father helped with the down payment. He did this openly, happily. It was discussed at dinner as a good investment in the family's stability. No one questioned it. The money that went to Emeka in the early years of his business, startup capital, equipment, a loan that was quietly reclassified as a gift about 18 months after it was given, that was also discussed openly, framed as investment, accepted as appropriate. Then there was me. I arrived 4 years after Chidinma. I arrived, I believe, slightly after my parents had completed their family in their minds. The heir was in place. The jewel was in place. I was the unexpected addition, the one for whom no role had been reserved, the one who spent her childhood filling the leftover space with the only tools available to her: observation, silence, and a talent for numbers that nobody in my family recognized, because nobody was paying close enough attention to recognize it. I was the child who read the lease agreements when they were left on the kitchen table. I was 11 years old. I want to pause here because I need to tell you something about how I'm telling you this story. I am being honest with you. I want to be clear about that. Everything I'm telling you, the facts, the dates, the conversations, all of it is true. What I have not promised you is that I'm telling you everything. There is a difference. My father understood that difference. It was, I think, the most important thing I learned from him. Not the real estate, not the numbers, not the patience, The understanding that truth and completeness are not the same currency. You can tell the truth in a way that leads someone precisely to the conclusion you want them to reach. I am going to keep telling you the truth. Pay attention to where it leads you. I left for London at 23 for a graduate degree in international development. My parents attended the going away dinner. My mother cried. My father gave me a check for $5,000, more than he had arrived in this country with, a fact I did not miss, and told me to call when I landed. I called. He was in a meeting. I left a message. I did not go home for 2 years. Not because I was angry, not as a statement. I simply found in London that the person I was in the absence of my family's idea of me was considerably more interesting than the person I was inside it. In London, I was just the D's. I was sharp and observant and good at understanding how systems worked. Professors liked me. Colleagues sought my opinion. I was invited into rooms not because of who my father was or what my brother had accomplished or what my sister represented, but because of what I brought to the table when I sat down at it. It was, I want to tell you honestly, the first time in my life that I understood what it felt like to be seen. Not performed for, not assessed, seen. I finished the graduate degree. I took a job at a nonprofit doing the kind of work that makes people nod approvingly at dinner parties, development finance in sub-Saharan Africa, grant management, partnership building with organizations that had good intentions and complicated structures and extremely limited resources. I was good at it. I was promoted twice in 2 years, and then I took the other job. I am going to tell you about the other job the way I told my family about it, which is to say, briefly, and without the parts that matter. The firm was called Ashfield Capital Partners. It was a private investment consultancy based in the city, London's financial district. For those who don't know, that worked with high net worth individuals and institutional clients on portfolio structuring, asset protection, and what the industry calls alternative investments, which is the term used for investments that are not stocks or bonds, real estate, private equity, commodities, structures that sit in the interesting gray spaces of the financial world. Legal, entirely legal, but not simple and not transparent in the way that conventional investments are transparent. I worked there for 6 years. I learned things in those 6 years that I will not describe in detail, because the detail is not the point. The point is the category of things I learned. I learned how capital moves between structures. I learned how assets can be held in ways that separate ownership from visibility. I learned how wealth is built, not the kind that shows up in magazine profiles, but the quieter kind, the kind that accumulates in the spaces that most people don't know to look in. And I learned something about my own family that I had always sensed but could not have articulated before. My father was an intelligent man who had built significant wealth, but he had built it openly, straightforwardly. His name was on everything, every property, every account, every document. He had been a man who trusted the visibility of his own work, who had never seen a reason to be anything other than legible. I came to understand, sitting in glass offices overlooking the Thames, exactly how many things that legibility made possible, and exactly how many it made impossible. I returned to the United States at 31. Atlanta, not home. I told my parents I was doing consulting. This was true. I told them it was financial consulting. Also true. I did not elaborate, and they did not ask, because I had spent enough years outside the family's gravitational field that I had become, to them, the kind of person whose life you asked about at holidays and then moved on from, the way you ask about a country you've never visited, pleasantly, briefly, with no real expectation of understanding. I set up my practice. I took clients carefully, for in the first year, referred through a network I had built in London. Then 6. Then I stopped counting clients and started counting outcomes. The work was bespoke. Each engagement was different. What they shared was complexity. Clients who had assets in multiple jurisdictions, structures that needed to be examined for efficiency, portfolios that had grown past the point where a conventional financial advisor could meaningfully service them. I was good at this work in the way I had always been good at quiet, detailed, invisible things. I was also, during this same period, building something else. Something that was not for clients. Something that was entirely my own. I had started it in London, in my 3rd year at Ashfield, when I understood enough to begin moving carefully. I built it the way my father had built his portfolio, slowly, without announcement, in the spaces between other things. A property here, an account there, a structure that held the properties in a way that kept my name adjacent to them, rather than directly on them. By the time I returned to Atlanta, the structure held 4 properties of my own in 2 states, a set of investment accounts across 3 different vehicles, and a total asset value that I tracked in a spreadsheet I kept on an encrypted drive. By 2019, the year my father's attorney called me, that number was $4,700,000. I want you to hold that number. My family thought I needed their money. I had $4.7 million that they had no idea existed. Money built over 15 years, quietly, in the spaces they weren't looking. But here is what I need you to ask yourself. Right now, pause and actually ask it. Why had I never told them? A woman with $4.7 million, sitting at family dinners, answering questions about whether she's seeing anyone, nodding while her mother piles extra food on her plate out of pity. Why would a person do that? Take a guess. Put it in the comments, because the answer to that question is the actual center of this story. And I'm not going to give it to you yet. The call from Harold Osei came on a Tuesday afternoon in May of 2019. Harold was my father's attorney. Had been for 22 years. He ran a small estate planning and business law practice out of Decatur. Not flashy, deeply competent, the kind of practice that second-generation West African professionals build when they have decided that trust matters more than scale. I had met him 3 times before that call. Twice at family gatherings my father brought him to, once at an office visit when I was home from London one summer, and my father asked me to stop by with some documents. He had struck me as precise and cautious, the kind of man who understood the weight of the information he carried, and had developed, over decades, a very careful way of carrying it. He said, "Adiz, your father has asked me to reach out. He would like to meet." I said, "About what?" There was a pause, not a long one, just long enough to be intentional. Harold Osei did not pause accidentally. He said he wants to make sure certain things are properly understood before the conversation happens at the family level. I remember the exact quality of the silence in my apartment after he said that. The refrigerator humming, traffic outside, the weight of a sentence that had been constructed very deliberately, in which every word was load-bearing. Before the conversation happens at the family level, I said I would be there Thursday. Harold's office was on a side street in Decatur that had been gentrifying for 15 years without quite completing the process, which gave it the specific atmosphere of a neighborhood that couldn't decide what it was becoming. His building was older, brick, with a brass nameplate by the door that had been polished recently enough to catch the light. I noticed the nameplate. I noticed most things. The waiting room was empty. His assistant, a woman in her 50s with the unhurried precision of someone who had been managing a professional schedule for decades, offered me coffee. which I accepted and directed me to a chair. The chair faced a window that looked into a small courtyard. I sat and watched the courtyard for 6 minutes before the door to Harold's office opened. My father was already inside. This was the first thing that told me something about the nature of this meeting. My father had arrived first. My father, who was 73 years old and not in the best of health, had driven himself, or been driven, to this office and settled himself in the chair across from Harold's desk, and was sitting there when I walked in with a posture that cost him something. I could see that, but that he was maintaining anyway, because posture was not something Chukwemeka and Mosu compromised. He looked at me when I walked in. His eyes were clear. "At ease," he said. Confirmation, not greeting. I sat down. Harold closed the door. What followed was 40 minutes that I am going to share with you partially. Not because I'm protecting myself, because I'm protecting him. My father said things in that room that were about himself, his regrets, his recognitions, the specific accounting a man does when he understands that the long game is entering its final phase. Those things are his, and I will not put them in a YouTube video. What I will tell you is the shape of it. He told me he had made decisions about the estate, that Emeka and Chidinma had each received substantial financial gifts over the years, gifts that, aggregated, represented a meaningful advance on their inheritance, that I had received comparatively little because I had asked for little, and because he said, looking at me with those clear eyes, always believed I would be fine. He said it without apology, just as a fact. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "And are those decisions reflected in the current will?" Harold shifted in his chair. My father said, "That is what we need to discuss. I want to be very specific about what happened inside me in that moment. Not what I showed. What happened inside. I felt nothing that resembled surprise. That is the honest answer. What I felt was closer to the particular alertness that comes when a thing you have been watching approach for a long time finally arrives. A sharpening. A settling into place of something that had been slightly out of alignment. Harold walked us through the current structure. Emeka, 8 properties, including the 4 highest value assets. Chidinma, 2 properties, substantial cash bequest, a piece of jewelry. Me, 2 properties, the lowest value ones, and a cash amount that was relative to what the estate represented, a rounding error. My father said, "These decisions were made some time ago. Your mother and I agreed on them." I said, "I understand." And here is the thing I did understand. I understood more precisely than my father knew. Harold was watching me with the expression of a man reading something in a language he mostly, but not entirely speaks. I said, "I appreciate you telling me directly, Baba." Before the family conversation, my father nodded once. That nod, that single, precise nod, was the most complicated thing I had ever seen him do, because it meant several things simultaneously. It meant, I respect you enough to tell you the truth. It also meant, I am telling you now so you cannot say you were ambushed. It also meant, and this is the part one turned over for months afterward, something that might have been an apology, or might have been something else entirely. I drove home in silence. I made dinner. I sat down at my kitchen table and opened the spreadsheet. For $1,700,000. I looked at it for a long time. And then, and I need you to hear this carefully, I started to think. I want to stop here and invite you into something. You've been watching this story build. You have an idea of who I am. You've probably decided whether you're on my side or not. Maybe you're angry at my family, at a father who told his youngest daughter she would be fine, at a mother who made decisions for him, at a brother who managed without grieving. Maybe you feel sorry for me. I want you to pay close attention to that feeling, to whether it survives the next part of this story, because this is the point where I stopped being a person things were happening to. This is the point where I started making things happen. It happened 14 months after Harold's call. July 2020, a Sunday. Emika's house, 4-bedroom colonial, landscape front yard, a kitchen that his wife Nneka had renovated twice because she was the kind of woman who improved things and then improved the improvements. 12 people at the table. My parents, my siblings and their spouses, the older children, me. I arrived exactly on time, which in my family is considered slightly early. I brought wine I had selected carefully. 2 bottles, well regarded, not ostentatious. I greeted everyone in the correct order. I complimented Nneka's kitchen, which was genuine because the kitchen deserved it. I sat where I was directed, which was midway down the table, which was where I always sat, which was neither the center nor the periphery, but the careful, familiar middle distance. The food was extraordinary. My mother had cooked, which at family dinners meant that Nneka had prepared the space and done considerable work, and then reseated as my mother moved through the kitchen with the authority of a woman on her own territory, regardless of whose house she was in. There was a gussie soup, jollof rice, fried plantain that was exactly the correct shade of caramelized, goat meat that had been marinating since the night before. My father ate slowly, with focus, which was a good sign. A sign that this was a clear day. The conversation was the conversation. It always was. Updates on the grandchildren. A property in Emika's portfolio that had needed unexpected roof work. Church politics, specifically a leadership dispute at my parents' parish that had been ongoing for 3 years and showed no signs of resolution. My mother had opinions. She always had opinions. She expressed them with the warmth and certainty of someone who had never once questioned whether her perspective was the authoritative one. I ate. I listened. I watched the table. It was between the main course and dessert, in the specific suspended moment of a family dinner when the food is mostly gone and the table opens into something more candid, that my mother made her announcement. She did it the way she always did important things, embedded inside something else. She was talking about the coming year, about plans, about how she and my father had been having conversations about the future. Her voice had the even, informative quality of a weather report. And then, still in that same voice, still looking at a fixed point somewhere between her empty plate and the centerpiece, I ate. I listened. I watched the table. It was between the main course and dessert, in the specific suspended moment of a family dinner when the food is mostly gone and the table opens into something more candid, that my mother made her announcement. She did it the way she always did important things, embedded inside something else. She was talking about the coming year, about plans, about how she and my father had been having conversations about the future. Her voice had the even, informative quality of a weather report. And then, still in that same voice, still looking at a fixed point somewhere between her empty plate and the centerpiece, I picked up my water glass. I drank from it slowly. I set it down. I said nothing. Later, after dessert, after the first wave of dishes, after the table had loosened into the smaller conversations that family gatherings resolve into at the end, Emika found me in the kitchen. I was rinsing plates. He stood beside me at the counter, close enough to be private, far enough to maintain the appearance of normalcy. He said quietly, with what I am certain he believed was kindness, "You understand how it is, Ada. You've always been independent. You've made your own way. You don't need it the way we do." I handed him a stack of plates. I said, "I understand." He nodded. He carried the plates to the sink. He was satisfied. I could feel his satisfaction from across the counter, the specific relief of a person who has said the difficult thing and received no resistance and believed, therefore, that the thing had been accepted. I stood in my brother's kitchen and felt something clarify inside me. Not anger, something colder than anger, something that required planning. Here is what I want you to do. I want you to pause this video right now. Before you hear the next part, I want you to think about the person you believe I am at this moment in the story. Write it down if you can, or just fix it in your mind. The picture you have of Adiz Nwosu standing in her brother's kitchen with wet hands and a clear expression and something cold inside her. Hold that picture, because the next 14 months are where this story happens. Not in the lawyer's office, not at the reading. The 14 months between that kitchen and that conference room, that is where the real story is. And I'm going to tell it to you. All of it. In my way. I want to tell you about a spreadsheet. Not the one with the 4.7 million. A different one. I started this one in August of 2020, approximately 3 weeks after the dinner at Emika's house. It was a simple document on its surface, a timeline, essentially structured around my father's estate and the people connected to it. Property valuations, account structures, the names of everyone involved in managing, documenting, or executing anything related to my father's finances. Tenants, contractors, the bank where my father held his primary accounts, Harold Osei's firm. I am very good at spreadsheets. I spent the first month in research mode, which is the mode I know best. The mode where you gather without acting, observe without revealing, build the complete picture before you touch a single piece of it. I knew from my years at Ashfield that the most expensive mistakes in any financial situation come from acting on incomplete information. You look at what you know and you think you see the whole shape of the thing. You don't. The whole shape is always larger and more complicated than what's visible from any single vantage point. So I looked. Now, and I want to be precise about this, I want to tell you what I was looking for. I was looking for leverage, not the kind that hurts people. I want to be careful here because leverage is a word that sounds like threat, and what I was building was not a threat. It was a position. There is a difference. A threat is what you deploy when you have nothing. A position is what you occupy when you have everything you need and you simply have to wait for the right moment to reveal it. What I had was my $4.7 million, which nobody knew about. What I needed was a clear understanding of exactly how my father's estate was structured, not because I planned to contest it, but because you cannot play a game well if you don't know all the rules, and the rules in estate planning are in the details. I want you to sit with this for a moment, because here is where the story starts to become something you have to decide about. A woman who has been quietly cut out of her family's will goes and studies in careful detail every document and structure and relationship connected to that will. She does this without telling anyone. She does this for months. She is meticulous. She is patient. She was trained by one of the most sophisticated financial consultancies in Europe. Is she protecting herself, or is she building something? And is there actually a difference? In January of 2021, I called Harold Osei's office and made an appointment. I was specific about what it was not for. It was not to discuss my father's estate. I told his assistant I wanted to review my own financial planning documents, that I had been intending to update my arrangements for some time. That Harold's firm had been recommended. When I arrived, Harold greeted me with a precision that told me he had thought about this meeting before I walked into it. I put a folder on his desk. The folder contained what appeared to be a comprehensive summary of my financial position, properties in Georgia and Tennessee, a series of investment accounts, a total asset figure that, when Harold looked at it, caused a pause just long enough to be meaningful. He looked up at me. He said, "This is substantial." I said, "I've been building it for a while." He asked questions. He was thorough. 3 rounds of questions about sources, documentation, structure. The questions of a careful man making sure he understood what he was looking at. I answered all of them without hesitation because I had been prepared to answer them for much longer than he knew. When we finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as the particular recalibration that happens when someone realizes the person across the table has been significantly underestimated. He said, "You've been very thorough." I said, "I learned from my father. And here's the thing I need you to hold." Harold Osei had known my family for 22 years. He had known my father since before I left for London. He had sat in that meeting in 2019 when my father told me what the estate looked like. He knew what I had been told. He knew what I had been given. And now he was sitting across from me looking at a folder that told a completely different story about who Adiz Nwosu was. Before I left, Harold said something quietly, looking at his desk. He said, "Your father is a good man, Adiz. Whatever happens with all of this, I want you to remember that." I stood up. I said, "I know he is." I drove home. I made tea. I opened the spreadsheet. And I made a decision. I need you to understand what kind of decision it was, because the family will tell you one version of what happened next. I'm telling you another. And the truth, the actual truth, requires you to hold both versions at the same time, which is uncomfortable, but it is what truth actually is most of the time. I decided to have a conversation with my father. That is all I will tell you. A conversation. With my father. Alone. In the house on Clover Lane. On a Sunday afternoon in February 2021 when my mother was at church and Emeka was at a property and no one else was present. What we talked about, the specific content of that conversation, I am going to keep between me and him, because he is gone now, and some things should stay where they were said. What I will tell you is that when I left that house, after 2 hours, my father walked me to the door, which he rarely did. He stood at the door and watched me walk to my car. And before I got in, I turned back, and he was still there, standing in the door of the house he had built himself, in the life he had built himself, looking at his youngest child with those clear eyes. He said something. Across the yard, in the cold February air. I am going to tell you what he said at the end of this story. Not yet. The spring of 2021 was hard. My father's condition moved faster than the doctors had predicted. Not dramatically, not in the cinematic way that stories about illness tend to describe, but in the quiet, cumulative way of a tide that is pulling something out to sea. A word lost here. A date confused there. The occasional full afternoon of clarity that made the subsequent fog harder, because it had showed you what was being taken by showing you what was still there. My mother managed the information the way she managed everything, in careful doses, distributed to the family on a schedule that preserved the narrative she preferred, which was competent management rather than irreversible loss. She told Emeka more than she told Chidinma. She told Chidinma more than she told me. By the time she was telling me anything, I already knew it from other sources that I will not name here. I was present. I want to be clear about that. I drove to the house on Clover Lane at least twice a month throughout that spring and summer. I sat with my father. I brought him things, newspapers he could no longer read easily, foods he had always liked, recordings of music from home that sometimes seemed to reach him in the spaces that the disease had opened. I sat beside him and talked to him about properties, about numbers, about the things that had always been our language. On some of those visits, my mother was there, and on some she was not. On the visits when she was not there, the house was different, quieter, more itself. My father was different on those visits too, more present, often, or differently present, more willing to sit in silence, more willing to let the time be what it was. During one of those visits, in August of 2021, my father asked me to help him with something. I am going to tell you what he asked, because this is the part of the story where the family's version and my version differ most sharply. And you need to understand what I am claiming and what they are claiming, so that when the room in Harold's office tells you its own version, you will be able to hold the contradiction. He asked me to reach out to Harold, to tell Harold that he, my father, wanted to add something to the estate documents, that he had made a decision, and he wanted it recorded before the window closed. Those are the words he used. Before the window closes. I called Harold that afternoon from the driveway. I said, my father would like to schedule a meeting. He says he has a decision to add to the estate documents. Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he said, is he having a clear day? I said, yes. Harold said he could be there Thursday. What happened at that Thursday meeting I was not present for. I had driven my father to Harold's office and sat in the parking lot while they met inside. 40 minutes. My father walked out with the particular expression of a man who has done something he had been thinking about doing for a long time. He got into the car. I drove. He looked out the window at the September warm streets of Decatur and said nothing for the first 10 minutes. Then he said, it's done. I said, good, Baba. He said, you will understand it later. I did not ask what he meant by that. I did not ask because I thought I already knew. And this is the part of myself I am being honest about right now. To you, I was not entirely sure I wanted to know whether what I thought was what was true. Some knowledge changes the shape of things. Some knowledge you cannot unhave. I need to stop here, right here, and I need to talk to you directly. You have been watching this story build for a long time now. You've been patient. You've held the pieces I've given you and you've been turning them over, feeling for the shape of the thing. And right now, right at this moment, you have a question. You might not have framed it exactly yet, but it's forming. Let me help you frame it. Here it is. Did Adiz Nwosu engineer what happened in that lawyer's office? Did she have a plan? Did she build toward it, piece by piece, meeting by meeting, conversation by conversation? Did she use her access, her knowledge, her understanding of financial structures and legal documents, and the specific vulnerability of an aging man who loved her in his way and who had, perhaps, in the clarity of his last clear years, started to feel the weight of what had been given to some children and withheld from another? I want you to ask that question. I want you to hold it. And I want you to notice something. Notice that as you ask it, your feeling about this story shifts. Maybe just slightly. Maybe more than slightly. Notice that you are now not sure who to root for. That is exactly where I want you. My father died in March of 2022. He went in the house on Clover Lane. In his bed. My mother was with him. Emeka arrived within the hour. Chidinma flew in the next day. I drove through the night. When I arrived, the house was full in the way houses are full after a death. People moving through rooms performing the rituals of comfort, food appearing from nowhere, the telephone ringing with a persistent, respectful insistence. I went through the rituals. I received the embraces. I let my mother hold me for longer than she usually held me, which told me something about her own grief that she would never have expressed in words. Then I went to my father's room. He was still there. The funeral home was coming in the morning. The room smelled like him still. a specific combination of the soap he had used for 40 years and old books and something underneath, both of those things that was simply him. I sat in the chair beside the bed, and I held his hand, and I talked to him for an hour. I told him about a property I had looked at in East Point. I told him the numbers: cap rate, cash flow, occupancy history, the things that had always been our language. I told him it was a good investment. I don't know why those were the words I found. They were just the ones that came. At some point, I became aware that my mother was standing in the doorway. I looked up. Our eyes met. She held my gaze for one long moment. Then she turned and walked away. I stayed until the funeral home came. I helped with the arrangements because I had always been good at managing details, and because the activity kept the grief at a useful distance. I wrote the obituary. I coordinated with the church. I called extended family in Nigeria whose numbers I had been given by my father years ago in a handwritten address book that he kept in his desk drawer and that I had copied out on one of those August visits while he slept in the afternoon. I copied it because families are complicated and documentation matters. Remember that later. The weeks between the death and the reading moved strangely. The family orbited each other in the contracted way of people who are managing a shared loss and a shared anticipation simultaneously, grief and calculation occupying the same rooms, using the same faces, sometimes indistinguishable from each other. I watched the way I had always watched. Emeka was in the properties within the week. Not aggressively. This was practical, understandable. The properties needed managing, and he had always managed them. But there was something in the speed of it that told me his grief was taking a managerial form, and that the management had been, in some part, prepared for before the death had occurred. His conversations with my mother about the estate were happening in rooms that went quiet when I appeared, which told me they knew enough to be conscious of my presence, which told me they had begun, at some point, to wonder about me in a way they hadn't before. This was new, and it was useful information. On the fourth day, I found my mother in my father's study, sitting at his desk, a folder open in front of her. Harold Osei's firm name on the tab. She did not hear me come in. She was reading. Her reading posture was the same as it had always been, slight forward lean, one finger at the edge of the page as if she might need to turn it quickly. She was reading with an intensity that was separate from grief. She was looking for something. I said her name. She looked up and closed the folder. One smooth, practiced motion. She said, "Come in, Adiz." I was going through some papers. I came in. I sat down. We talked about the arrangements for 20 minutes. When I left the room, the folder was closed on the corner of the desk. Its position had shifted slightly from where it had been when she closed it. I need you to hold two questions simultaneously. What was in that folder that she was looking for? And did she find it? Because both of those questions have answers. And the answers are different from what you might be assuming. And I'm going to bring you right to the edge of them. And then I am going to take you into that conference room and let you watch what happens. And at the end, at the very end, you are going to have to decide what you think. Not what I tell you to think. What you actually think. November 14th, Harold Osei's office, 11 in the morning. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat in the waiting room with the same courtyard view I had looked at in January 2021. The courtyard was bare now, late autumn, everything stripped back to its essential shapes. I looked at it and thought about shapes, about how things look different once everything decorative is removed. Harold came to the doorway before his assistant could announce me. He shook my hand. I had never seen him shake anyone's hand in a waiting room before. He held the contact one beat longer than necessary. I said, "Good morning, Harold." He said, "Good morning, Adiz." And something in the way he said my name, with a precision that was separate from formality, told me that he had been thinking about this morning for a long time too. We went into the conference room. It was a rectangular room, dark wood table, 8 chairs, a credenza along one wall, a window that faced the street. Harold's documents were already arranged at the head of the table. A pitcher of water, glasses, the careful choreography of a room where difficult things are transacted. I chose my seat deliberately, not at the head, not at the far end, midway down on the window side, which put the light at my back and left the faces of the people across from me in slightly more exposure than my own. This is a thing I learned at Ashfield. Light is information. Information is position. Position is leverage. My mother arrived with Emeka and Nneka. They came in together, which told me the drive over had included conversation. My mother's eyes moved to me immediately. She clocked my position at the table, and I watched something register in her face, a small adjustment before she chose her seat. Across from me. She sat directly across from me. She never did anything accidentally. Chidinma and her husband arrived 4 minutes later. He shook Harold's hand. She hugged me briefly with genuine warmth. I received it. Harold waited until everyone had water. Then he began. The standard language. Condolences. Gratitude for being present. The formal identifications of documents. His voice had the specific quality of a man who has delivered difficult news many times and has learned to pace the delivery so that the body can absorb what the mind is being told. I watched the table while he spoke. Emeka had his hands flat on the surface. He was doing the thing he always did when he was managing his own reactions. He became very still, like a man making himself into furniture. His wife Nneka sat close to him, not touching, her gaze moving between Harold and the window in a way that suggested she had already calculated some version of this outcome and was now simply tracking how closely reality was matching the calculation. My mother was still, completely still, the tissue in her hand and used, her eyes on Harold. Chidinma was watching Harold with the open, grieving attention of a person for whom this was primarily a loss and only secondarily a transaction. Her husband was watching me. I kept my hands folded on the table and my expression exactly what it needed to be. Harold moved through the bequests. Emeka, 7 properties, including the 4 highest value assets, primary cash accounts, and management rights to the remaining portfolio. Harold placed the property list on the table and pushed it gently toward the center. Chidinma, 2 properties, cash bequest, the jewelry. Me, 1 property, the duplex on Fairview. Harold placed that page on the table. I looked at it. The Fairview duplex had an assessed value of $212,000 and had not had a meaningful rent increase in 8 years. Emeka exhaled. A small, controlled sound. The sound of something settling. My mother's hands were completely still. Harold turned a page. He said, "There is an addendum." The temperature of the room changed. Not metaphorically. Something actually shifted. The air, the way people were breathing in it, the quality of the attention that 6 people were directing at a single point. My mother's still hands became stiller, which I had not thought was possible. Harold said the addendum had been executed by my father in August of 2021. That independent cognitive assessments, he placed them on the table, 2 documents, the names of 2 separate neurologists on the letterheads, had confirmed his capacity for legal decision-making at the time of signing. He placed the assessments in the center of the table with the care of a man placing evidence. Emeka said, "What kind of addendum?" Harold said, Your father established a joint account in October of 2019. It has been maintained since that date. The addendum directs that the account in its entirety be transferred to a D's. Chidinma said, a joint account with who? Harold said, with me, as trustee. A joint account between my father and his own estate attorney. An account that had existed for over 3 years without anyone in the family knowing about it. An account that now, by my father's explicit and legally documented instruction, belonged to me. Emeka said, what is the value? Harold said, as of this morning, $241,000. The room was a specific kind of quiet that I have only heard a few times in my life. The quiet of people processing something that requires them to revise a picture they had considered complete. Emeka looked at me. In 15 years of adult life, across hundreds of family dinners and gatherings and conversations where I had been peripheral or overlooked or gently managed, I had never seen the expression that was on my brother's face at that moment. It wasn't anger. Anger he could have managed. What it was, what I watched him trying to contain, was the specific devastation of a person realizing that the game they thought they had won had been played on a different board entirely. He said my name. My mother looked at me. Her eyes moved from Harold to me, and they held there with the expression of a woman recalculating at extraordinary speed. Chidinma's husband was still looking at me. He had not stopped looking at me since I sat down. I kept my hands folded. I said, I think we should let Harold finish. Harold turned the page. And here's where I have to be very precise about what I tell you. Because what Harold said next is the part of this story that the family is still processing. That I am still, in certain quiet moments, processing myself. He said there was a letter attached to the addendum, handwritten, in my father's handwriting, confirmed by the same neurologist whose assessment sat in the center of the table. Written in the same window, August of 2021. Directed to be read aloud at the estate reading in the presence of all beneficiaries. Harold unfolded it. My mother made a sound. Small, involuntary. The sound of something that has been braced against for a long time, finally arriving. Harold read the letter. I am not going to tell you what it said. I am going to tell you why. Because my father wrote that letter in the last clear season of his life. Because whatever he chose to put in it, whatever he understood, whatever he had decided, whatever he knew about his youngest daughter and the 14 months that preceded that August and the February visit and the conversation in the house on Clover Lane, whatever he put in that letter is between him and the people who were in that room. I will tell you this. When Harold finished reading, he folded the letter with the same careful precision he brought to everything. He placed it in the folder. He looked up. My mother was looking at me, not with anger, not with grief, with the expression of a woman who has understood, finally, the full shape of something she has been looking at for years without seeing it. Was it recognition? Was it accusation? Was it something that had no name in any of the languages our family moved between? I held her gaze. Outside the window, November light fell through the glass and across the table and the folder and the 6 faces of people sitting inside the aftermath of a story that had been running. Underneath the story they thought they were living for much longer than any of them knew. My brother's hands were flat on the table. My sister was very still. Harold gathered his documents, and I sat with my hands folded exactly as I had planned, in the room where everything was now different and nothing would ever be explained completely. Here is the thing about dark secrets. Everyone assumes they belong to the people doing the hiding. But sometimes, a secret is not hidden at all. Sometimes it's simply placed somewhere that requires the right person to know where to look. My father built everything he had in plain sight, quietly, patiently, in the spaces between what other people were paying attention to. I learned from my father. What I built the same way, in plain sight, over many years, with patience that looked to the people watching me like stillness, like acceptance, like the quiet of a woman who had made her peace with being the least important person in the room. But here's the question I am going to leave you with. The $4.7 million I had built, my money, built by my own hands over 15 years, nobody questioned it. It was mine. That is not the question. The question is about the other thing. About the February conversation. About the August meeting I drove my father to and waited in the parking lot for. About whether I had simply told my father the truth about what the family was doing, or whether I had told him the truth in a specific way, framed in a specific sequence, emphasizing specific things, leading him toward a specific conclusion. About whether the account he established in October of 2019 was the idea of a man acting freely and clearly, or whether it was the idea of a man who had been given, with extraordinary care and precision, exactly the right information at exactly the right moment. About what was really in the folder I placed on Harold Osei's desk in January of 2021, and about what Harold Osei understood when he looked at the contents of that folder about the woman sitting across from him, and whether what he understood made him more likely or less likely to schedule the August meeting quickly and to bring 2 independent neurologists to confirm capacity beforehand and to draft the addendum language in a way that would survive scrutiny, and about whether the words my father said to me from the doorway on that February afternoon, the words I told you I'd share at the end, were the words of a man who had made a free decision, or the words of a man who had been helped to make one. My father said from the doorway, across the cold yard, in a voice that reached me clearly despite the distance, "You were always the one who understood." I got in my car. I drove away. What he understood about what I understood. What I understood about what he understood. Whether those 2 things were the same thing. Whether either of us was who the other one thought. I'm not going to answer that. I told you at the beginning that this story would end with a question still open. That was not a warning. It was a promise. You have everything I have given you. The facts, the timeline, the meetings, the conversations, the folder on the desk, the account, the addendum, the letter I won't show you, the expression on my mother's face that I can't name. It is yours now. Decide what you think happened in the house on Clover Lane. Decide who Adiz Mosu actually is. Drop it in the comments, because I've been reading comments for a long time, and I've found that people see the truth much more clearly than they think they do. They just don't always want to say it out loud. This is your chance. I'll be here.